The call came as I was settling in for a long night of cataloging the artifacts from my last case, a jagged knife etched with runes of an origin no one could identify, and a broken mirror said to have shown the true face of anyone who gazed into it. My line of work rarely allowed me peace. My phone buzzed against the scarred wood of my desk, and I answered without hesitation. Detective Graves. The voice was trembling, raw with panic. This is Raul Martinez. I'm calling from Calavera, a village near the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico. Please, you must come at once. What's the situation, Martinez? I asked, already jotting down notes. The name stirred something in the back of my mind, a faint recollection of a forgotten legend. 30 people are dead, Raul said, his words sharp but cracking like dried leaves. They were killed, torn apart. And feathers, senor, feathers everywhere. Feathers? The word echoed in my ears. What kind of feathers? Green, gold, radiant, he continued, his voice almost breaking. The elders say it's Kukulkan, the feathered serpent. They say he's angry, and he's come to punish us. Kukulkan. The god-king of Mayan legend, a deity of wind, rain, and storms. Stories spoke of his wrath, how he could summon tempests or devour entire villages if insulted or provoked. But this was 2024, not 824. Gods didn't walk among men anymore, no matter how much some believed. Still, I couldn't ignore 30 bodies. I had faced stranger things, creatures that defied understanding, curses that killed, and rituals that blurred the line between man and God. If Kukulkan was a vengeful myth, it would fall to me to separate truth from legend and put a stop to it. I'm on my way, I said. The journey to Calavera was as isolating as it was beautiful. The jungle around Chiapas is an entity of its own, a vast, breathing labyrinth of green that felt alive with eyes, watching from the shadows of leaves and vines. The roads narrowed to mere paths, and I had to hire a local guide named Eduardo to get me the rest of the way. You know the village? I asked as we trudged through dense foliage. I've been through there, Eduardo replied, though his eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead. But not since the killings began. Nobody wants to go near it now. Do you believe it's Kukulkan? Eduardo hesitated, then muttered, belief doesn't matter. The jungle has spirits, senor, and some should not be disturbed. The air grew heavier as we approached Calavera. When we arrived, I understood why Raul had sounded so desperate. The village was a scene from a nightmare. Blood stained the cobblestones of the plaza, and the walls of huts bore claw marks that no animal could have made. A foul smell hung in the air, like rotting meat and burnt offerings. The villagers avoided us, peering out from behind shutters. The fear on their faces was palpable, their skin pale against the warm hues of the setting sun. Eduardo crossed himself and whispered something under his breath before pointing toward a gathering of people near the church. You'll find the mayor there, he said, backing away. I'll wait here. Mayor Mariana was a stout woman, her face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. She led me to the site of the killings without a word, only crossing herself as she motioned for me to enter. The plaza's center had been turned into a makeshift morgue. 30 bodies lay there, arranged in a spiral pattern that radiated outward. Their chests were torn open, their hearts missing, and surrounding them was an ocean of iridescent feathers. I crouched down to examine the scene. The feathers were beautiful, brilliant green and gold, like they had been plucked from a living god. Blood soaked them, though the feathers themselves seemed untouched, as if they repelled the gore around them. Who did this? I asked, looking up at Mariana. It wasn't a man, she whispered. It was Kukulkan. We heard the wind roaring that night, like 1,000 screams. Then the storm came, and the killings began. 30 people in one night, I murmured, my gaze shifting to the sky. That's not a man's work, I'll grant you that. But a god. 1 month ago, a group of outsiders came to the village, she said, her voice trembling. They spoke of reviving the old ways. They went to the temple at Yaxchilan and performed a ceremony. When they returned, they said Kukulkan was coming back. And now he's here, I said grimly. Or at least something is. Mariana nodded. The leader of those men was Esteban Morales. He claimed he was chosen by Kukulkan himself. He hasn't been seen since the killings began. The pieces began to fall into place, an ancient ritual, an obsessed zealot, and now 30 bodies. If Esteban had unleashed something, I needed to know what it was and how to stop it. That night, I met with Calavera's remaining elders, a group of 3 stooped men who seemed older than the jungle itself. Their hut was filled with the smell of burning sage, and their walls were covered in carvings of gods and monsters. You seek the truth about Kukulkan, one of them rasped, his cataract-clouded eyes staring through me. But you will not like what you find. Tell me, I urged. What did Esteban awaken? Kukulkan is not a man or a beast, the elder said. He is a force, an embodiment of the storm and the serpent. He is anger made flesh. If Esteban called him, it means blood was spilled on holy ground. The pyramid, I guessed. Yaxchilan. The elder nodded. If the spiral of the dead is complete, the cycle has begun. Kukulkan will not stop until he has claimed the unworthy. And who are the unworthy? Anyone who has forgotten the old ways. I left the elder's hut with a knot in my stomach. If they were right, Calavera's 30 dead were only the beginning. I had to find Esteban, and I had to end whatever madness he had unleashed. But as I stared into the jungle that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was already watching, waiting for me to make my move. At first light, I prepared for the trek to Yaxchilan. The pyramid lay deep within the jungle, shrouded in mist and myth. Mayor Mariana provided a guide, a wiry young man named Luis, who looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else. The pyramid is cursed, he muttered as we set out. Even before the killings, people avoided it. They say Kukulkan guards it now. Do you believe that? I asked, keeping my voice steady as I scanned the dense foliage around us. Luis hesitated. I know what I've seen. The wind doesn't move right around the temple. The jungle gets quiet, like it's holding its breath. You'll see. We pushed deeper into the undergrowth, the heat oppressive and the air thick with the smell of decaying vegetation. As we moved, I noticed the signs, gouges in the trees, feathers caught on branches, and tracks that were neither human nor animal. This isn't recent, I observed, pointing to a feather half buried in the mud. Luis nodded. The jungle's been restless since Esteban's group went there. We paused at a stream to refill our canteens. Luis kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand never straying far from the machete at his side. What's bothering you? I asked, though I already had a sense of his answer. We're being watched, he whispered. The moment he spoke, the jungle fell silent. No birds, no insects, just an unnatural stillness. My hand went to the revolver holstered at my side, and I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I caught a flicker of movement, something long and sinuous, disappearing into the shadows. Let's keep moving, I said, my voice low. Luis didn't argue. The pyramid at Yaxchilan rose from the jungle like a sleeping giant, its stones weathered by centuries but still exuding a sense of power. The carvings of serpents and warriors seemed to shift under the sunlight, as though alive. Luis refused to climb with me. I'll stay here, he said, his voice trembling. If anything comes, I'll try to hold it off. I didn't argue. As I ascended the steep steps, the air grew colder, and the wind began to howl. At the summit, the altar was exactly as the elders described, stained with blood, feathers scattered around its base. A journal lay there, its cover warped by moisture but intact. It belonged to Esteban Morales. As I flipped through the pages, his descent into madness became evident. We called him, one entry read. We bled for him, and he answered. Kukulkan has returned to cleanse the unworthy. The final page chilled me, the storm is his herald. The feathers are his gift. He will make me his prophet. Before I could digest the implications, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that froze my blood, a low, guttural growl, like the rumble of a distant storm. I turned, my revolver drawn, just as the air around the pyramid began to shimmer. A figure emerged from the shadows below, a towering form draped in green and gold feathers, its serpentine head crowned with fangs and gleaming red eyes. Kukulkan. I stood frozen at the summit, the great feathered serpent staring up at me. Its body coiled like a storm, its scales glinting with an unearthly light. The air around it seemed alive, crackling with energy that made my skin crawl. The god tilted its head, as if studying me. A voice thundered through the jungle, though its lips didn't move. You are not of this land, yet you stand upon my altar. Why do you seek me, mortal? I'm here to stop you, I said, forcing strength into my voice. It laughed, a sound like rolling thunder. Stop me? Foolish. The unworthy have called me, and I have come. Their blood fuels my return. Their fear feeds my wrath. You've killed enough, I said, stepping forward. 30 lives lost because of your so-called return. That ends here. The god's eyes flared. You presume to command me? You, who are as fragile as the leaves. Prove your worth, or join the unworthy in death. The wind surged, nearly throwing me from the pyramid. I raised my revolver, but the bullets would be useless. This was no ordinary creature, this was a force of nature, a storm given form. Desperate, I reached for the talisman I had taken from Calavera, a crude carving of Kukulkan given to me by one of the elders. I pressed it against the altar, shouting an incantation from the journal. The serpent recoiled, its body writhing as the talisman glowed. It hissed, its voice reverberating through the jungle, you dare bind me? This is not over, mortal. My vengeance will consume you. With a final roar, the god vanished, leaving behind a trail of feathers and the stench of ozone. I stumbled down the pyramid, my body trembling from the encounter. Luis was waiting at the base, his machete drawn and his face pale. What happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kukulkan was here, I said. But he's not gone. He's bound to something, or someone. Esteban, Luis said immediately. He's the one who started this. Then he's the key to ending it, I replied. As we began the journey back to Calavera, the jungle seemed darker, heavier. The air hummed with a tension that made every step feel like a test. I knew Kukulkan was watching, waiting for me to falter. And I knew this was only the beginning. The trek back to Calavera was suffused with an oppressive silence. The jungle, usually alive with the cacophony of insects and birds, was now eerily quiet, as though even the creatures of the wild had fled the wrath of Kukulkan. I glanced at Luis. His machete trembled in his hand, and his eyes darted nervously toward every rustling leaf. You're sure Esteban hasn't been seen since the killings began? I asked, breaking the silence. Luis nodded. No one has seen him, but there have been stories. Shadows in the jungle. Voices that aren't human, calling his name. The words lingered in my mind like a haunting refrain. Esteban Morales had summoned Kukulkan, but to what end? Power? Salvation? Or something darker? His journal suggested he sought to be the god's prophet, but 30 deaths and a vengeful deity were hardly the marks of divine favor. As we neared the village, the first signs of trouble became evident. Smoke rose from the plaza, curling black against the gray sky. Shouts and screams carried on the wind, mingling with the crackle of flames. Luis froze. Something's wrong. I drew my revolver, motioning for him to follow. Stay close. And don't run unless I tell you. Calavera was in chaos. One of the huts burned furiously, its thatched roof collapsing in embers. Villagers ran in all directions, their faces masks of terror. Near the center of the plaza, a group of men struggled to restrain a writhing figure on the ground. Mariana spotted us and rushed over, her face streaked with soot. "Detective Graves." "It's him, Esteban." I pushed through the crowd, Luis close behind. The man on the ground was barely recognizable. His skin was pale and stretched taut, his veins blackened like the roots of a dying tree. His eyes glowed faintly, the same malevolent red as Kukulkan's. "Hold him!" I barked, kneeling beside the convulsing man. "Esteban Morales." The figure hissed, its lips curling back to reveal jagged, broken teeth. "You're too late," it rasped, its voice layered with an otherworldly timbre. "He is already here. He is in me." "You brought this on yourself," I said coldly. "Where is Kukulkan? What does he want?" Esteban let out a guttural laugh, his body convulsing violently. "He doesn't want. He takes. He has made me his vessel. Through me, he will devour the unworthy." Before I could press further, Esteban's body arched unnaturally, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The light in his eyes flared, and his body burst into green and gold feathers, scattering into the wind. The villagers recoiled, gasping in horror. Luis crossed himself, muttering a prayer under his breath. I stood, brushing feathers from my coat. "He's not gone," I said grimly. "He's free." The skies above Calavera darkened as an unnatural wind swept through the village, carrying with it the scent of rain and decay. The villagers huddled together, their eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's him," Mariana whispered, her voice trembling. "Kukulkan is coming." The feathers left behind by Esteban began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the rising wind. I knelt to examine one, feeling a strange warmth emanating from its core. "These aren't ordinary feathers," I murmured. "They're tied to him somehow. His power, his presence, it's in them." Luis glanced at the growing storm clouds. "If he's coming, we don't have long." I stood, addressing the crowd. "Listen to me. Kukulkan feeds on fear and blood. If you run, you'll only make yourselves his prey. We need to prepare, to fight." "Fight a god," one man scoffed, his voice thick with panic. "We'll be slaughtered." "Not if we stand together," I said, injecting as much authority into my voice as I could muster. "We have weapons, fire, iron, salt. They may not kill him, but they can weaken him." Mariana stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We'll do as you say. But you must lead us." I nodded. "Gather everyone in the church. If we're going to survive, we need a plan." The Church of Calavera was a small, weathered building, its walls adorned with faded images of saints and crosses. It was the only structure in the village sturdy enough to serve as a fortress. The villagers worked quickly, barricading the doors and windows, setting up makeshift weapons, and sprinkling salt along the thresholds. I stood at the front, Luis and Mariana beside me. The air inside was thick with tension and the faint scent of burning sage. "Listen carefully," I began. "Kukulkan is no ordinary enemy. He's a force, a storm given form. But storms can be weathered. If we hold our ground and fight together, we have a chance." "What about the feathers?" Mariana asked, pointing to the glowing remnants scattered on the floor. "They're anchors," I said. "They tie him to this place. We need to destroy them before he fully manifests." Luis stepped forward, holding a torch. "Then let's burn them." I hesitated. The feathers pulsed with an almost hypnotic light, their energy palpable. Destroying them might weaken Kukulkan, but it could also unleash something worse. Before I could decide, a deafening roar shook the church, and the doors buckled under an unseen force. The villagers screamed, clutching their makeshift weapons as the wind outside howled like a living thing. "He's here," Mariana whispered, clutching her cross. I drew my revolver, loading it with silver bullets. "Everyone, hold your ground. This isn't over yet." The roar outside grew louder, shaking the church walls until dust fell from the beams above. The barricaded doors buckled again, the wood groaning as if under the weight of an immense force. Villagers clutched their weapons, machetes, pitchforks, torches, while others murmured prayers under their breath. "Stand ready," I shouted, stepping toward the doors with my revolver raised. The glowing feathers scattered around the church pulsed faster, as though responding to the entity outside. With a deafening crash, the doors exploded inward, sending shards of wood flying. The villagers screamed, but no one fled. Through the shattered entrance, a figure emerged, a serpentine silhouette draped in a mantle of green and gold feathers. Kukulkan. The god's form seemed to shift as it moved, its body both solid and ethereal, coiling like smoke. Its eyes glowed a fierce, unholy red, and its fanged mouth curled into something that might have been a smile, or a snarl. "Mortals," the entity intoned, its voice resonating through the church like thunder. "You cower in fear, yet dare to defy me. I have come to claim what is owed. Blood for the serpent, and life for the storm." "No one's dying tonight," I said, stepping forward. My voice trembled, but I kept it steady. "You've taken enough." The god tilted its head, studying me with curiosity. "And what are you? A priest? A warrior? Or merely a fool?" "I'm the one who's going to stop you," I said, raising the revolver. "One way or another." The first shot rang out, the silver bullet piercing the air with a sharp crack. It struck Kukulkan's form, but instead of piercing flesh, the god's body rippled as though made of water. Kukulkan hissed, its eyes narrowing. "You dare?" it growled, the air around it vibrating with fury. The god lashed out, its coiled tail whipping across the floor. The impact shattered pews and sent villagers scrambling for cover. "Fire!" I shouted, and Luis hurled a torch at the god. The flames caught on its feathers, burning unnaturally bright. Kukulkan screeched, recoiling as the flames spread, but the fire didn't consume it entirely. Mariana stepped forward, holding a vial of salt water. "To the unholy," she cried, flinging it at the god. The liquid struck Kukulkan's form, and the air filled with the sound of sizzling, like flesh meeting hot iron. The god roared, its voice shaking the very foundation of the church. "You cannot kill me. I am eternal." "Maybe not," I muttered, reloading my revolver with trembling hands. "But we can damn well try." As the battle raged, I noticed something strange. The glowing feathers scattered across the church floor were pulsating even more intensely now, their light growing in tandem with Kukulkan's fury. "Mariana!" I called. "The feathers, get them out of here." She nodded, shouting for the villagers to gather the feathers. One by one, they swept them into a sack, careful not to touch the radiant plumes directly. Kukulkan turned its gaze toward them, its serpentine form lurching forward. "Fools! You cannot sever me from this place. The feathers are my essence, my bond to your world. Destroy them, and you destroy your own hope. Don't listen to it." I yelled, firing another shot. The bullet struck Kukulkan's head, and while it did little more than enrage the god, it bought us precious seconds. Luis lit another torch, holding it over the sack of feathers. "We burn these now, or we die." "No!" Kukulkan bellowed, its voice filled with something close to desperation. "You will unleash the storm. You will summon the end." I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If Kukulkan was telling the truth, destroying the feathers could unleash something far worse. But if we didn't act, the god would tear us apart. "Do it," I said finally. Luis thrust the torch into the sack, and the feathers ignited in an instant. The flames roared unnaturally high, filling the church with a blinding green and gold light. Kukulkan screamed, its form writhing as though caught in an invisible grip. The god's body began to disintegrate, its feathers turning to ash and its serpentine coils unraveling into smoke. For a moment, it seemed we had won. But then the storm came. The air grew cold and heavy, and the howling wind tore through the shattered doors of the church. Rain poured in torrents, and lightning lit up the sky, illuminating Kukulkan's fading form. "You fools," the god roared, its voice echoing in the storm. "You have broken the bond, but you cannot contain the storm. I will take this land in vengeance. Your world will drown in my fury." The villagers screamed as the winds tore apart the barricades. I grabbed Mariana and Luis, pulling them toward the altar at the front of the church. "The storm isn't natural," I shouted over the cacophony. "It's him, his power, unleashed without form. We need to bind it before it destroys everything." "But how?" Mariana cried, clutching her cross. I looked down at Esteban's journal, still clutched in my hand. The final page glowed faintly, its words shifting before my eyes. A ritual, a binding spell, etched itself into the parchment. "Hold him off," I yelled, handing Luis the last of the saltwater and silver bullets. "I'll finish this." Luis and Mariana turned to face the storm, hurling whatever they could to keep the god's wrath at bay. I knelt at the altar, chanting the incantation written in the journal. The words burned my throat, as though they weren't meant for human tongues. The storm raged harder, and Kukulkan's form flickered back into existence, its eyes blazing with hatred. "You cannot bind me. I am eternal." "You were summoned once," I snarled. "You can be banished again." With a final shout, I slammed my hand onto the altar, completing the ritual. A surge of energy erupted from the church, engulfing Kukulkan in a vortex of light. The god screamed, its form disintegrating into feathers and smoke, which were sucked into the vortex. The storm ceased abruptly, leaving only silence. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with disbelief and relief. The church was in ruins, its roof torn apart and its pews splintered. But the storm was gone, and Kukulkan's presence had vanished. Mariana approached me, her eyes wide. "Is it over?" I looked at the altar, now blackened and cracked. "For now. But Kukulkan's spirit is bound to this place. If someone else calls to him, he'll return." She nodded solemnly. "Then we must ensure no one ever does." The morning after Kukulkan's banishment, Calavera was eerily quiet. The air, once heavy with dread, now carried a fragile sense of peace. Villagers worked tirelessly to repair their shattered homes, though their eyes constantly darted toward the horizon as if expecting the feathered serpent's return. I stood in the church, now little more than a skeleton of stone walls and ash. Mariana approached, her expression weary but determined. "You've given us a chance, detective," she said. "But how do we make sure no one ever awakens him again?" I looked around at the charred remains of the altar and the scattered ash of the feathers. "The pyramid at Yaxchilan must be sealed. The site's power is tied to Kukulkan's ability to manifest. Destroy the altar there, and you'll sever his link to this world." Mariana nodded. "We'll see to it. No one in Calavera will dare approach it again." "You'll need to warn other villages," I said. "The jungle is vast, and there are always those drawn to the promises of ancient power. They'll come looking for him." She gave me a grim smile. "I'll make sure the stories are told." Later that day, I walked through the village, observing the aftermath of the storm. The villagers avoided my gaze, murmuring prayers or clutching talismans as I passed. Luis caught up with me near the plaza, his machete hanging loosely at his side. "Are you leaving already?" he asked. "I have to," I said. "Kukulkan might be gone, but there are other things out there, other storms brewing." Luis hesitated, then said, "Do you ever feel like, maybe it's not worth it. Fighting these things. You've seen what they can do. I glanced at the burned ruins of the hut nearest to us. If I don't fight, who will? He nodded, though the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Before I departed, I visited the elders one last time. They sat in their smoke-filled hut, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You have done what many would not dare, one of them rasped. But Kukulkan is not the only god that sleeps. I frowned. What do you mean? The jungle is old, detective. It remembers what men have forgotten. The feathered serpent is but one of many spirits that linger in the shadows. Others are watching, waiting for their turn. I leaned closer. Do you know where? The elder smiled faintly, revealing teeth blackened with age. You'll find them, if you seek them. Or they will find you. I left Calavera as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the jungle in shades of gold and green. The road back to civilization felt longer, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily on my shoulders. Luis accompanied me part way, though he seemed more at ease now than when we had first entered the jungle. Will you ever come back? He asked as we reached the edge of the village's boundaries. I hope not, I replied honestly. If I do, it'll mean something worse has awakened. We parted ways, and I continued alone, the sounds of the jungle gradually fading as the path opened up to the wider world. The first night away from Calavera, I camped by a shallow stream, the firelight flickering against the dark canopy of trees. As I stared into the flames, I felt the presence again, not Kukulkan, but something older, something far more malevolent. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint whisper. It wasn't words, exactly, but an impression of hunger and malice. I drew my revolver instinctively, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, but the feeling lingered, pressing against my mind like a hand on my chest. You can watch, I muttered into the darkness. But you won't find me unprepared. The whispers faded, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Weeks later, I sat in my office, poring over maps and journals from past cases. The events in Calavera had left scars, on the village, on the people, and on me. But they had also left questions, threads of a larger mystery that I couldn't ignore. Kukulkan's return wasn't an isolated event. The journal I had taken from Esteban hinted at other rituals, other gods that slumbered beneath the surface of the world. And then there were the elders' words, their cryptic warning about spirits waiting for their moment. I stared at the map of Central America, my eyes tracing the jagged lines of rivers and mountain ranges. Somewhere out there, another storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before I would be called to face it. The feathered serpent was gone, but the jungle's secrets were far from buried. And as long as there were mysteries to uncover, I would keep walking the shadows, one case at a time.